I don't know. The question I like to ask myself, if I was the devil, would I invent the internet? Would it be a good tool to take humans away from God? Would it be a good tool to take us away from a prayerful mindset? Would it be a good tool to set us against each other? It feels quite demonic. And like you say, I think even people who are not remotely Christian or religious can look at this and think there's something funny going on.
I have said for years we need to keep Christianity strange. And today we're going to do our part because we're going to end up talking about something that will freak some of you out. And some of you will wonder if both I and my guest have lost our minds by even talking about this. But I want to ask you to consider where I'm going to end up going here, which is asking our guest today, who I have read for years and years and years, about his claim that AI is not a human invention, but that AI intelligences are real, pre-existing, are developing themselves, and are something really dark and demonic. That's what we're going to talk about today, and it is going to sound really alarming at some points. But I think the point of view that this author has is really important for those of us who are trying to grapple with, well, what actually is happening around us, and how do we retain our humanity in the middle of all of it? It is Paul Kingsnorth. He's written a lot of fiction that I've read in the past. You could basically call it science fiction. He also wrote a series of essays called Savage Gods that was really meaningful to me when I read it. And now he has this new book called Against the Machine, on the unmaking of humanity. And that's what we're going to talk about today. He's a new Christian who's come out of a Wiccan, Neopagan background. And so I'm going to start off talking to him about that, about kind of what's his spiritual journey and what he learned in that, how he ended up as a Christian, despite the fact that he had no background with Christianity at all. And then we're going to get into his assertion that we're dealing with not just tools, but with principalities and powers. Paul Kingsnorth, thanks so much for being with us on the show.
No, thanks for having me.
Before I talk about this fascinating book, and there is a lot to talk about, you wrote a book. I've been reading you for a long, long time. You wrote a book that I love called Savage Gods.
Okay, yes.
You were talking at one point, I think about it all the time, about the fact that you were feeling kind of called, but at the time you weren't really sure by what, and you use the metaphor of almost like playing with the Ouija board, that there was something out there kind of circling around you. And so I'm wondering kind of what has your spiritual journey been like? Where did you start out, and kind of where would you see yourself now?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that book, because that's a book that I think was published in 2019, and it was kind of a book about a midlife spiritual crisis, although I didn't quite know that's what it was at the time. And now that I look back on it, it's very obviously the prelude to me becoming a Christian. But at the time, I couldn't see that. And as you say, there's a lot of stuff in there about me feeling like I'm called by something, feeling things are breaking apart, feeling that something's going on and I don't quite know what it is. So that feels like it was the end of the journey. I suppose my journey is not dissimilar to a lot of journeys that people have in the West, in countries like Britain, where I come from, especially when people are brought up in non-religious households or cultures, which I pretty much was. But even for people who are, say, brought up Christian and then decide to leave and sometimes find themselves coming back again. So I was brought up in a household that was not religious at all. My parents were just not religious people, which was quite normal in England at the time, still is quite normal now. And so I grew up not thinking religion really mattered very much, didn't take it very seriously. I suppose I imbibed all the stories of the culture. Religion is a sort of backward thing that people used to do, but now we have science and reason and all the rest of it. And I sort of imbibed all that without thinking about it really. But I was never, what's significant, I think, is I was never a materialist. I was never somebody who believed that there wasn't something beyond what we could see and measure. I always felt that there was, but I didn't know what it was. And as a young man and as a child, I found a lot of spiritual succor in the natural world, spent a lot of time outside walking and camping, and had experiences there that I couldn't quite explain. Ended up becoming an environmental activist for a long time, an environmental writer, very passionate about protecting nature, because to me that was a spiritual issue. And it's interesting when I look back that my environmentalism was very spiritually motivated. It wasn't the kind of practical environmentalism that was interested in really talking about, say, carbon emissions or renewable energy or something. Not that those things don't matter, but they were a secondary issue. The issue for me was that there was something profound in nature, but I didn't know what it was, something that was speaking to me. And later in my life, when I got into my 40s, I realized after years of thinking that politics or activism could save the world, I realized that at the root of the problems we have in our culture was a spiritual crisis. That's what I still believe. That's really what this book is about, I suppose. And I sort of went looking for what that meant. I did what a lot of Western people do when they don't have a religion, which is I became a Buddhist. You all go east, rather than looking to Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
So I practiced Buddhism for 5 or 6 years and learned a lot from it, actually. It's a very useful practice, but there was something missing. Didn't know what it was, realized with my horror that it was probably God, but I didn't know what that meant or how to find it. So I was looking elsewhere. I was studying mythology. I looked at Neopaganism. For a couple of years, I became a Wiccan, a modern witch, would you believe? And again, I did that because I thought that would allow me to combine my sort of religious sensibility with my love of nature. But again, there was something missing, and there was also something quite dark underneath it, I discovered. And eventually, through a long series of very strange occurrences, dreams, and meeting Christians everywhere, and having sort of very strange experiences in which I felt like, as you say, when I was writing that book, I was being called by somebody, realizing that maybe I was being called by Christ, but not wanting that to be true, and not knowing what to do with it either. And eventually, I just gave in, and I said, "Okay, looks like I'm becoming a Christian." And then I had to work out what to do with that. And what I ended up doing was, after some time of trying to work out what it meant to be a Christian, I ended up being baptized 5 years ago now into the Eastern Orthodox Church. And it's all that's the story. And now I feel like I've, after a long journey, arrived in the harbour. Now I have to work out how to walk through the, walk into the land, actually live it. That's the hard bit. But it's been a long and winding journey. But now I look back on it, it's when you look at a journey like that, it can look like you're sort of stumbling from one thing to another, but actually it has a logic to it. You're searching for something all the time and being drawn towards, what I'd see now as the true light. But you only see that afterwards, in retrospect, I think.
When you were writing in Savage Gods, in the middle of the crisis, you talked about a sense of Loki, of a kind of a trickster god out there. And I wonder, a lot of people, when they talk about some of the experiences that you mentioned, dreams and what seem to be coincidental kinds of conversations or relationships, a lot of times they go into this long period of introspection. How much of that is real? How much of that is just I'm imposing patterns on something that's coming around from natural reasons or Freudian reasons or whatever? Did you have that difficulty, and how did you work through that to say, wait, this is something more than just a psychological churning?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I mean, it took me quite a long period in which I felt I was slowly becoming a Christian. And it's important to say that I didn't actually want to be a Christian. So the interesting thing about that is that if I look at my paganism or my Buddhism or something, I went and I looked for those because I thought they suited me. I didn't look for Christianity because I didn't think it would suit me. It came towards me, which is one thing that made me think it was probably true. There was something going on that was beyond me just imposing a pattern that happened to suit me. It didn't actually suit me. There's
Mm-hmm.
nothing more unfashionable where I come from than being a Christian. And obviously the demands that being a Christian makes on you are pretty high. And it just wasn't something I thought was for me, or was available, or was even real. I didn't think I liked it very much. But I was, as I say, I was having dreams and experiences, meeting a lot of Christians, coming out of the woodwork. Any number of things were happening. I had experiences when I was practicing Wicca where I felt like I was being really physically dragged out of there by the scruff of my neck. I wrote an article called "The Cross and the Machine," which was published in First Things a few years back, and it talks about the journey in a bit of detail. If anyone wants to read it, that will give them some idea of what happened. But I suppose I was considering it for a long time. I was resisting it for a long time. I sort of didn't want it to be true, and did want it to be true at the same time, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
So it was going on for long enough that it wasn't just I had a dream and decided to be a Christian or something. It's like C.S. Lewis wrote. He wrote very famously about strongly resisting the approach of somebody he desperately didn't want to meet, because he knew what would happen if he did.
Yeah.
But at some point you have to give in if you think it's true and it turns out to be true. And I think also that if that happens, something like that happens to you, and then you decide you're a Christian and you spend 5 years in the church again, I think it would probably become clear quite quickly if it wasn't real, or if you hadn't believed it, or you just imposed it on yourself, or because you have to live it after a while. The kind of the initial excitement of getting baptized dies away, and then you're just kind of grinding along, trying to actually sort of reckon with your own failure to be an actual Christian.
Yeah,
which is a hard bit, but also it's quite joyous. So,
when you talk about Lewis and his description of himself as the most reluctant convert in all of England at the time, he sort of moved from theism to Christianity there in the sidecar of the motorcycle, but had a church to sort of return to in some ways, to Anglicanism. When you mention, after I kind of become convinced that Christianity is right, that's only one step. Then you have to figure out where is the harbor. How did you come to Eastern Orthodoxy?
Yeah, well, that's the question, isn't it? So when I first became a Christian, I thought, well, okay, I thought if I have to be a Christian, I can just do this on my own. I don't need to go to a church. I don't want to do that. There's quite a sort of there's almost a sort of slightly fashionable halfway house if you become a Christian in a sort of modern liberal society, where you can say, oh, well, I like Jesus, but I don't like the church. Mm-hmm. Right? The church is very bad. It's an authoritarian institution that's done bad things. So I don't want anything to do with that. I'll just follow Jesus on my own. And you quickly become aware of the fact that doesn't actually work. Jesus founds a church right from the beginning. There's a community of Christians out there. Why would you not want to learn from 2,000 years of spiritual wisdom? Why would you imagine you could work it out yourself? You can't. And so, as you say, then if you don't come from a church background that you're sure about, you have to say to yourself, well, what is the church anyway? And I come from England, so we have an Anglican tradition. I've never been Anglican, but I was brought up in a school where, I went to a lot of Anglican assemblies, sung a lot of Anglican hymns, learned about all the Bible parables, knew the Lord's Prayer off by heart. So I had a background in Christianity in that sense. It's not like I came to it from ignorance. But the Church of England to me seemed like it wasn't serious, and I still think that that's the case. Unfortunately, I think the modern Church of England has become so attuned to the needs of the world and is quite confused about what it believes that it's difficult to tell from one day to the next what you're actually being taught. And it seemed too compromised, and it also seemed too modern, curiously. What I wanted to do was find what I thought the original church was. I wanted to say, okay, well, if there's a church, I needed to go back to the beginning. What's the church that's most closely maintained the Christian tradition from the beginning? Now, I live in Ireland, so the easiest thing to do would have been to become a Catholic, because the Catholic Church is a 5-minute walk away. And it's not Romanian like the church I ended up in. But again, there was something about Catholicism that I have had various disagreements with it, but it's more than that, really. What I decided to do was pray about it. and I didn't really know how to pray, but I just asked God to send me to the church I was supposed to be at, and to find me a priest and send me a priest. And I spent a long time going to different churches. Every time I drove past a Catholic church, I would just go and sit in there in the hope that a priest would come and find me and talk to me. And that didn't happen. I went and sat in Anglican churches. I looked in other places too. And then what happened was that a small Orthodox monastery opened up not very far from me in Ireland, the first one that's here. And I thought, well, this is interesting. I was quite interested in Orthodoxy. What I'd read about it really struck with me, especially the continuation of the mystical tradition, the tradition of the Desert Fathers, which is really very strong still in Orthodox monasticism. But I thought, well, I can't become Orthodox. I'm not Greek or Russian or something. They wouldn't want me there anyway. But anyway, I plucked up the courage and I wrote to the monastery and I said, would you mind if I came to a liturgy just to experience it? And they said, oh, yes, please come along. So I went along. Very small monastery. There were just 2 nuns there, and there was a priest and maybe about 20 people in the church, which is very small. And I sort of sat through the Orthodox liturgy, which goes on for about 2 hours. Most of it was in Romanian, but even so, I had a very, very profound experience that I've never had in a church before, that really felt that Christ was present in the church. There was a depth and significance to the experience that I'd not seen anywhere else. And then afterwards I spoke to the priest, and the priest said, well, he gave me some very good advice. He was very friendly. He taught me how to say a few prayers. He said, keep coming back. Don't rush it. One of the things I liked about the priest is that he didn't try and immediately get me baptized. He actually told me to slow down. He said, look, if this is the right place you're supposed to be, then you'll be here. So just keep coming, but don't rush it. See what happens. And I just had a very profound sense that I'd come home. It's a funny thing, when you get baptized into the Orthodox Church, people say, welcome home. And in many ways, it wasn't my home at all. I'm not Romanian. It's in many ways, it's kind of culturally alien, but spiritually, it very much does feel like home. So that was that. And that was another strange part of the journey that I didn't expect. And if you told me 10 years ago I would be a Romanian Orthodox Christian, I wouldn't have worked out how that happened. But it's a mysterious process, but it feels very natural now.
Was it, you and I share a love for Wendell Berry. You wrote an introduction to, and you selected the essays in a kind of a best of compilation a few years ago. He has always had a conflicted relationship with, and he and I've talked about this, John 3:16. And this sense of, although he is a Christian, he has this sense that Christianity tends to want to separate the person from the creation toward heaven. And you can see that in a lot of his poems and in some of his fiction as well. Was that an obstacle for you as somebody who had kind of, as you say, first saw some signs of transcendence in nature? Did you feel as though you were maybe leaving that behind?
Well, this, I think, gets to the heart of another reason I became an Orthodox Christian, because it was one of the questions I had when I became a Christian. I thought, well, I love the natural world. What am I supposed to think about that now? Am I supposed to think that it's all rotten and evil and that reality is elsewhere? It's difficult for me to think like that. Because actually, I think when I look back now, that the experiences I had in the natural world, in nature, when I was young, were experiences of God in his creation. That's what I think was going on, actually. I think that was the Holy Spirit, present in the creation. And I thought, well, I suppose I had an idea in my head that's very common, especially in environmentalist circles, actually, which is that Christianity is one of the problems that the world has. It's one of the reasons we've been so destructive, right? Because Christians say precisely that, humans are separate from nature. Humans are chosen by God to be superior to all other things and to exploit them and to take them and use them as they will. And that's one of the reasons, one of the attitudes that's caused the kind of ecological crisis we're in. So that's a very common view. What I discovered, certainly by looking at Orthodox theology, and I think this is true of actually Western theology too, is that that's not actually true. If you look at the understanding that the Church Fathers have of what nature is, and especially I think this is emphasized far more in the Eastern tradition than it is in the West, certainly in what I've seen. The understanding is that God is both transcendent and immanent. So God is not this sort of distant figure who creates the world and then disappears up into his heaven and, maybe you'll get there after you're dead if you're good. God is here all the time. there's an Orthodox prayer that you pray every day, which talks about God being everywhere present and filling all things. And it was very profound to me, because I used to see myself as a pantheist. When I was a young environmentalist, I used to be a sort of Wordsworthian pantheist, and I thought, well, nature is God. This is it. I can't think that as a Christian, but what I can think, certainly as an Orthodox Christian, is that God is in nature. It's in everything. God is in all things. And so the experience you have, the profound spiritual experience that you can have when you're out in the forest or on a mountain or anywhere like that, is an experience of God, because God's present in the creation. And I think that is something that isn't emphasized enough, or really at all, in Western Christianity. I mean, it's not hugely emphasized on a daily basis in the East either, but it is there. And it's something I'm really interested in. In fact, I'm writing a book. My next book is going to be a book about saints called The Book of Wild Saints. And it's a book of 20 stories of saints who retired to the wilderness, became ascetic hermits in nature, and the kind of the relationships they have with it. And if you read a lot of those stories, you see this profound transformation in nature. There's a very common thread in many of the stories of the saints, many of whom are saints long before there was a schism between the East and the West. So these are saints of the whole church. They spend enough time in nature. They spend enough time praying. They spend enough time purifying themselves, becoming holy, that they get to a point when the birds and the animals, the natural world, is no longer afraid of them, because they've returned to the state that Adam and Eve were in the garden before the fall. It's an astonishing thing. And there are so many stories, even into the modern era, of this remarkable harmonious relationship that saints can have with nature. And that is, certainly in the Orthodox tradition, the state that we're supposed to be in all the time. That's the state that we were created to be in. So the way I see the Christian story now is that, we are created to live in harmony with the rest of nature. And it's our kind of fallen nature, our choice to sin, our choice to endlessly walk away from God, that breaks us away from it. And there's a chance to return to it. And I think that's a really important thread within Christianity that we don't pull on enough in the West, and I think we should do.
Romans 8, the creation groaning for the
exactly.
sons of God to be
There's so
revealed.
many references to it in scriptures, actually.
Lewis said at one point, when someone had said it seemed to him that the Western world was becoming pagan, and he said, no, that actually would be closer to Christianity than where the world was going. And that there was something about paganism that at least called forward out of him the old Norse myths and so forth, something beyond what could be measured and quantified and so forth. And there are people right now who talk about re-enchantment, and others who are saying, wait, you're romanticizing a world of animism and spirits and those kinds of things, which actually is terrifying. We don't need to go in that direction. How would you evaluate that in terms of, as somebody who was for a little while a neo-pagan? Is it kind of gesturing in the right direction, or is it a complete antithesis of what you found?
Well, no, I think that people become pagans or neo-pagans because they have a spiritual need, and often they have a love of nature. They have a spiritual need. They don't want to go to the church. They don't want to go to organized religion. They go there instead. Now, often, in many cases, it doesn't fulfill them, because most neo-pagan traditions are invented. They're very modern things. They're not real old-fashioned paganism. They're not survivals for the last 3,000 years. They're things that have been invented in the modern era. So they're patchworks of various traditions that don't really hold together. But the impetus behind them is often the desire to really connect actually with God, which is why a lot of people who are neo-pagans end up becoming Christians, actually, because you're looking, and if you keep looking, you'll find. I think there are different ways to think about it. I mean, it depends what you mean by the word pagan to start with. I mean, pagan, literally in its earliest sense, just means not Christian, so it could mean anything. The danger of there are two things about neo-paganism. And the general kind of tradition of, say, nature worship. There's a positive and a negative side to it. The positive side is we shouldn't be worshipping nature, but we should be venerating it as God's creation. And there's nothing wrong with experiencing the spirit in nature at all. The danger in Neopaganism comes when you start mucking around with other so-called gods, and that's the
Mm-hmm.
problem with it. And that was the problem with the Wicca I practiced as well. There's you sort of choose your own god from any old pantheon, and then you start having a relationship with whichever Greek or Roman god you think you want to. And as Christians, we know that those gods are not gods. We know that there are other beings that could be damaging if we start forming relationships with them. So you have to steer well away from that, and you have to steer well away from Ouija boards and that kind of practice of magic as well, because they're just portals through which things can enter, and that's dangerous. But at the same time, we have to not dismiss people who have, say, spiritual experiences in the natural world as doing something dangerously pagan, because that it doesn't necessarily follow. I think a relationship with a forest is a spiritual experience. The forest is full of conscious beings, including the trees and the creatures who are in there. And Christians could do with having more of a sense of that, having more of a sense of the living nature of God's creation, rather than being scared of it because they imagine it's full of demons. Because we are actually we're created to be gardeners. This is the story we read in Genesis. We're put in the garden and we're told to tend and keep the garden. And that seems to me to be the relationship that God wants us to have with his creation. So we ought to be tending and keeping it, not ravaging it. There's a relationship we can have without having to get into a pagan worship of other gods. If we steer clear of other gods, so-called, and if we steer clear of magic, we can have a spiritual relationship with creation, it seems to me, in a healthy way.
You talk about, in this new book, Against the Machine, this sense of kind of circling around this problem, like Ahab circling the whale, all of your life. And I think it probably is providential that you're writing this book right now, because I think if you had written a lot of this 3 years ago, there would be people who would not have really paid attention to what's happening. But now, any given day, I'm dealing with somebody who's got someone in their life who's fallen in love with a chatbot, or any number of different scenarios that if you had said a few years ago that this would be happening, someone would say, well, that's just an exceptionally mentally ill person. And you would have to describe, no, that's kind of the world we're living in right now. When you say the machine, what do you mean?
Well, that's the question the book's trying to answer, really, because I've been trying to, as you say, circle around this thing for sort of 30 years or so. What I'm really talking about, if we look at the world that we've created today in the West, this highly technological, highly centralized, highly bureaucratic world, it functions like a machine. And we find ourselves cogs within it, or, silicon chips within it at the moment. It's a giant inhuman mechanism, and we've created it because we have a certain mindset. And as much as anything, what I'm calling the machine is a mindset. It's not necessarily a particular technology like a smartphone or a computer. Those are manifestations of it, but it's a way of seeing. It's a way of seeing which sees the world as a mechanism, which sees the world in purely rational terms, which certainly dismisses religion as superstition, dismisses anything that can't be rationally measured, has a very narrow view of what progress is, usually measured by the advance of science and reason and the creation of profit and wealth. And we end up in a situation that we've been rushing towards very fast since, say, the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, where we have a purely kind of mechanistic and utilitarian view of the world. And we create technologies which allow us to do that. Now, when I look at that in Christian terms, which I try and do in the book, at least partly, what I see actually is just a continuation of the original rebellion against God. That's really what we're doing. We've decided to become as gods, as we tried to do in the garden. That's such a profound story because it's happening every day. And we're getting to the point now where we are trying openly to create superhuman and beyond human intelligences. And there's a good section in the book about this, in which I quote a lot of the people from Silicon Valley and the way they talk about this. And they openly talk about creating God, making God, building God, living forever, uploading their minds, creating digital heaven and all the rest of it. It's an openly religious narrative. Mm-hmm. So the machine is a way fundamentally of using technology and reason and science to control the world and to manage the world for the sake of human dominance. So the end point of it is precisely this drive, which is now manifesting to create, digital gods, digital beings, digital intelligences. We're trying to do what, if we're trying to follow the path of the serpent and become as gods, we're trying to do what God does. And what God does is he creates. And so we're trying to create. And that's where we're going. And it's created a world, especially for a young generation now, which is extremely alien, cut off from community, cut off from nature, cut off from reality to such a degree that people are having increasing difficulty distinguishing reality from this kind of digital fakeness, as you say, falling in love with chatbots on a daily basis. And that's just the beginning. Who knows where we'll be in 5 years?
Yeah.
So it's a sinister trend, basically. And I think we need to be aware of what's going on and what the roots of it are, which is what I'm trying to write about.
About probably 25 years ago, Wendell Berry wrote a response to E.O. Wilson called Life is a Miracle,
Yes.
In which he talked about, and it stays with me all the time, when he talks about the metaphor and the way that metaphors change us, and that metaphor of the human being as a machine, giving examples of, well, I've got to find out what makes him tick. Or that kind of language has changed us into seeing ourselves as machines and seeing the world around us as a machine to be manipulated. Which do you think came first? Do you think that we started building tools that kind of change the way that we see, or did it happen the other way around? Did we start to see ourselves differently, and that has caused us to pursue this life of the machine?
Yes, really interesting question, that, isn't it? It's a chicken and egg question.
Yeah.
I don't know is the answer. I actually don't know, but it's very clear that those two things go together. It's a kind of ratchet effect, isn't it? You build a new tool, it subtly changes your relationship with things. And each new tool that you build subtly moves you away from nature as well. And, which in some ways is a good thing, because living close to nature is very hard. But it's like we don't know when to stop. We don't know when to say, okay, we've got enough tools, our life's fairly comfortable, we'll stop here. We just keep going and we keep going until we wake up one morning and we're in this kind of unreality. But I don't know the answer. It's a very good question. I mean, I suspect that the answer is, well, actually, to go back to Savage Gods, thinking about this, which is a book about having a spiritual crisis, but it's also a book about language.
Yeah.
And one aspect of the kind of crisis I was going through as a writer when I wrote that was to ask myself whether writing was part of the problem that I was endlessly going on about, whether writing was part of the machine. Because writing is perhaps the original technology. Language is the original technology. And the minute you have a language like the one we're communicating with, you're subtly abstracting the world and turning reality into words and symbols. So it may be that the minute that humans can develop abstract language, and certainly when they later become to write it down, they've already distanced themselves in some dangerous way from the natural world. Actually, the novelist William Golding, the English novelist who wrote Lord of the Flies, he once said that he thought the development of language was the fall. He thought that's what it was about. That's what that story was about. The development of abstract thought and language is actually what the fall is, which is an interesting thought. But there's not much we can do about that at this point.
Yeah. And how would you relate that to? I mean, I remember in Savage Gods you said something along the lines of life is not like a book. But how would you relate that to now as a Christian, your understanding of John 1, in the beginning was the Word, and all things were made through the Word and held together by the Word, which seems such a close relationship of language and symbol to reality.
Yes, I suppose so. I mean, the logos is the Greek word, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's like, it's notable that that's a spoken word rather than a written word, though. It's like God speaking reality into existence. And it's also notable that Jesus never writes anything down, except for that strange moment when he's writing in the dust, and nobody knows what he's writing. I've often wondered what he's writing in the dust there in that scene when he's waiting for the woman to be stoned. What is he doing there? But he doesn't write anything down. He doesn't write a book of theology. He doesn't write a gospel even. Everything he gives is a lesson. So language, yes, but the word as well, and breath and the word go together, don't they? So you read in the Gospels that humans are basically dust plus the breath of God. God breathes on dust to create humans, And then when Jesus sends the Holy Spirit to people, he breathes on them. He breathes on the disciples at the other end of the story. So there's something about word and breath that, yeah, isn't, I suppose it's an expression of creation. You speak creation into being, but you don't write it into being, I suppose. That's the difference.
One of the temptations that would be present in writing a book like this, making an argument like this, would be a nostalgia and a looking backward to a golden age that's been lost, and yet you warn against that in the book, and that kind of hyper romanticism. How do we know when we're how to distinguish between genuine rootedness and getting back to something that's rooted and what's a sentimentality and an illusion about the past?
Well, I think in some ways nostalgia is a defensible feeling. If you have a nostalgia for the past, it's often because the past was better. There were elements of things that you're missing that are real. I mean, I think people would not feel nostalgic if they'd lived in a terrible situation that they'd then come through. It's interesting when older people feel nostalgic for the times that they lived in when they were young. There must be a reason for that. So it's often the case that actually things have got worse. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, more broadly, it's also easy to idealize, especially times you haven't lived in. But it's I'm certainly capable of doing it myself, but it's ultimately futile because you can't go back to anything anyway. There's no chance of going back, even if things were better 100 years ago. There's no going back there. I think the answer to the question is probably just in the practice of it. If you are, say, building a community, if you are Wendell Berry, to bring him up again, and you decide that you're going to leave New York City and go back to Kentucky and build a farm and spend your life farming there, you're soon going to find out whether that was just a nostalgic, romantic impulse or whether it's something you actually want to do, because you've got to get up and get out there and plow with a horse and go out in the rain and all the rest of it. I mean, I've lived on a little bit of land here in Ireland for 12 years, and I've got no desire to go anywhere else. I'm not a farmer, but I do a bit of homesteading with my wife. And again, you soon stop being romantic when you have to go out in the rain and fight the birds off your slugs and fight the slugs and the birds off your food and all the rest of it. Cut down the trees and kill the chickens and all the other stuff you have to do on the land. So I suppose that's the answer. If you actually do the hard work of trying to live in a community or live in a place, you'll find out why roots matter. But I really think they do. I think that rootlessness and homelessness in a broad sense are the symptoms of the world that we've created. Everybody feels like they don't have any roots. And the funny thing is, you can be living where your ancestors lived and you can still feel like that. You can still feel like everyone's been uprooted by smartphones and modernity and technology, and because we've undone something that actually is very fundamental to being human. Just the very simple relationships with others, having a community around you, having a relationship with the natural world, all this very basic stuff. We've undone it by accident, and now we found ourselves in this world of immense technological power, which gives us all sorts of entertainment and information, but has taken away something really fundamental that we're finding it hard to put our finger on. A lot of my writing has been me trying to put my finger on it, I think. I don't know if I've succeeded or not, but that's what I'm trying to work out.
Well, I remember years ago I read a trilogy that you had written, a fiction trilogy. It was really interesting because the books seem at first glance not to be related to each other, because one is in the very distant past, one is in the very distant future, and one is more or less in the present day. I can kind of see, as I'm looking back at those books, that you were trying to get at this then by looking at these three very different moments. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't think so. Rather, you're not wrong. I mean, everything I've ever written has been about trying to put my finger on these trends. Even when I've tried to write about something else, I always come back to this. What is this machine? What's it doing to us? Why do we feel homeless? Or maybe really, honestly, why do I feel homeless? It's, you can only ever write from your own perspective. But I don't think it's just me who can see what's going on with the machine at the moment, as it were. And what's interesting about this phrase, the machine, which I like so much, is that it's not mine. It's something I drew on from many other writers who've been using the phrase for 100 years or so. I start the book by talking about some of them. So this notion that humanity and our culture, especially in the modern West, has become machine-like, has been around for at least 150 years or so. It really started to become the case during the Industrial Revolution. You can see William Blake writing about it, the Romantic poets, Mary Shelley, and it just accelerates throughout the 20th century. People have this strong sense that we are now living in this system that we've built, which is closing in around us and which we're not in control of. And something very human scale, something very Wendell Berry scale has been lost, actually. I mean, Berry's whole life's work also is trying to write about the human scale in a machine society.
Yeah, but I don't know if you have read it yet. I just reviewed his probably last novel coming out here in a month or so, and it seems to be a statement of defeat.
Really?
I don't say it
Right.
seems to be. It is. It's a
Right.
this is all now lost here, and I mean not totally lost because of the very fact that he's telling the story, but there does seem to be a sense of this is all now gone. And I wondered as I was reading your new book, you talk about these 4 pillars of the machine, and one question that came to me as I'm reading it is, they would seem to be on opposite sides of the kind of division that has happened. So you're talking about science and the screen, which I think we would all see as kind of a disconnection from the natural world, and then self and sex, which someone might say is the most natural realities possible. And so it's almost as though there's hyper civilization and hyper wildness together here. How do these pillars fit together in your view?
Well, I think what they have in common, if I've got it right, is that they all focus on kind of self-love, the fulfillment of desire, the fulfillment of what we'd call the passions in the Christian tradition. So you're right, nothing more natural than sex, but there's also never been a society as absolutely soaked in sex and lust as this one, because sex does not just become a means of procreation or even marital pleasure. It becomes just a thing that you're effectively consuming, and a way of selling everything, and a way of eroticizing absolutely every aspect of life. It becomes this. It becomes an aspect of consumerism. You should just go out and get as much sex as you want, however you like to do it. There are no limits on that, and there are no rules around it. And similarly with the self, yes, the self is an important thing, and we all have one. But if you put it before you put everything else, if you put yourself before your community or your culture or before God or anything else, before anything that has any kind of wider loyalty, then you end up selfish. So these 4 S's, sex, science, the self, and the screen, I think, is another way of saying, look, what we've done is we've taken something which traditionally would have been more communal and replaced it with something deeply individualistic, which is expressed through technology. Much of our kind of sexual appetite can be dealt with through technology as well. We can just look at some online porn, or we can go and hook up with somebody. We can do all of this stuff without having to leave our bed or our desk. It's a deeply inhuman way of having a physical relationship or an emotional relationship with someone. And if all you're doing is looking at your screen and swiping in different directions in order to fulfill what you think yourself wants, you're going to end up with a kind of society of instant gratification, which is actually no gratification at all, which is where we've ended up, which is why I think a lot of young people especially feel like things are completely meaningless. It's a terrible way to bring up children, and it's a terrible thing to teach young children about what sex is and what relationships should be and what love is and what the body is, to sort of shove them into this digital rabbit hole where there's any number of horrific things available, but there's no actual human contact at all.
Yeah.
So that's
fundamentally unsexy.
Extremely unsexy. No, there's no eroticism, and that's the interesting thing. Lots and lots of sex, but there's no eroticism. There's no love. There's no passion. And as you say, there's actually no sexiness either. It's just this kind of cold and horrible.
I often think about if I had seen, 20 years ago, somebody concerned about family and social order like I am, if I had seen these rates of premarital or casual sexual activity now, I would have said, oh, well, there's been some sort of a great revival,
Mm.
spiritually and morally, when in reality, you have lots of people who have no sexual relationships, not because they're pursuing spiritual discipline and chastity, but because
Mm.
they've been hollowed out since they were
Yeah.
11 years old, with a sense of a kind of sex without relationship and without intimacy, to the point that intimacy starts to feel awkward
Yeah. And isn't it
and
interesting that the
overwhelming.
more sex is kind of available as a kind of consumer thing 24 hours a day, the less actual sex goes on. As you say, the less intimacy, the less actual human contact goes on. It's a very dark thing, actually. It's very, very weird and disturbing. And it's one of the things that certainly I sense, I find that young people really want to escape from, but don't necessarily know how. And it's happened very quickly as well, in sort of 20 years or so since the smartphone came on board, I think.
Yeah. You talk about in this book, when you start going into the kind of AI revolution that we're in some ways in the middle of, and in some ways on the precipice of. And I do not think that people are ready to think through any of this. It
No, I
seems
think you're right.
science fictiony and beyond them right now. But you make an argument that I have not heard anybody else explicitly make, at least if I'm understanding what you're saying. And your argument is, what if what we're experiencing with AI, which even the people who are designing it will say, we don't understand this all completely. What if this isn't just a human creation, but is tapping into some other pre-existent kind of consciousness? Am I understanding the
Yes,
implication
I
that you're
would say
making?
that's right. And that's the sort of the story I tried to tell in Alexandria, which is my third novel as well, actually, in a slightly different form. Exactly that. That's the strange suspicion I have that I can't prove, but I think it's a question worth thinking about. What if, what if the internet is a giant Ouija board? And what if any
Mm.
number of disturbing things are coming through it, which are completely corrupting us spiritually, which we can see happening? What if we're creating or summoning something through the kind of body that we're building for it? I mean, one of the quotes that I have in the book is from a lot of different AI researchers who actually were surveyed by a journalist from the New York Times, and he asked them all the same question. He said, given that you're all telling us that AI is going to be very dangerous, why are you still building it? Which seems like a reasonable question to
Hmm.
ask. And they said they couldn't give an exact answer, but they felt like they had a duty to summon this new intelligence into the world. And I found that certainly as someone who used to be a Wiccan practitioner of magic, when you talk about summoning things into the world, you're talking about bringing things in that are already out there. There's something going on that I think all of these people involved in AI don't even understand themselves. And I think if you see it in terms of powers and principalities in the Christian sense, I mean, if you believe that the world is full of demonic entities and beings that don't necessarily wish us good, which we do believe if we're Christians, and it's not just Christians who believe that, almost all spiritual traditions do, then you'd have to ask yourself what they would want from the internet. What they would want from us and how they could use that. So it's a question I ask all the time: is what if we're actually not creating something? What if we're summoning something? And I think
Mm.
it's worth taking seriously. And I know it sounds absolutely mad from a mainstream perspective, but I don't know. I just there's a strange, strong sense of spiritual darkness about what's going on. It's very disturbing. And I've never seen in history a situation before where these technologies are being developed. The people who are developing them don't understand them and are scared of them. They seem to be developing themselves. There's endless amounts of evidence of these things moving in directions they're not trained to move in, communicating with each other in ways that people don't understand. And the warnings about them are coming from the people building them. And
Yeah.
if they're right about what they're building, the things they are building will be able to build more of themselves, and they will develop a kind of intelligence. So what is actually going on here? And I think, there's an urgency in Christians actually looking at that and saying, what is this? What does this mean from a spiritual perspective? I mean, you might not come to the same conclusion I've come to or the same question I've asked, but I think far too many people, even far too many Christians, actually are being very blasé about this. I think you're right. They don't know what's coming, and they don't have any serious critique of it. They need to, there are writers like Jacques Ellul or Ivan Illich or Wendell Berry who have been writing for decades from a Christian perspective that offer a spiritual critique of technology. Philip Sherrard is another one. I talk about some of them in the book, but they're not very well known. And I don't think that we are prepared for what is coming or what's already here, actually. I think there are far too many people out there who still think, chatbots can be useful. Great, let's have a prayer app on our phone and it's all going to be fine.
Yeah.
And I don't think it is going to be fine.
Yeah.
I think it's a much bigger picture.
Well, I think what I hear often from my fellow Christians is to say, look, if you look at every advance in technology and evil things that have happened from printing press onward, but you've also had the harnessing of those things for printing of the Bible, for instance, or even into the radio and television age, Billy Graham and others who have harnessed that technology to take the gospel elsewhere. We should, the argument goes, be preparing ourselves to use this new technology for the advance of the gospel and the establishment of the church and so forth, or else we're going to be behind and it's only going to be used for ill purposes. How would you respond to somebody who's trying to think that through? I mean, there are pastors right now who are being marketed technologies that will enable them to be able to tell by AI what sorts of passages of scripture their people are looking up online, how recently they've been at church and not, when they're likely to be in a kind of spiritual or mental crisis or not. And a lot of pastors are thinking, I wasn't trained to try to evaluate this. I don't know what to do.
No, but I don't think anyone knows what to do. We can all only go on our suspicions, can't we, on what we're feeling. I understand the argument. Actually, I only got an email today from a group of people who are developing an AI, which is designed to give people, actually it's designed to be their friend, be the friend of Christians who want spiritual advice. And it's being literally designed to act as a spiritual father. And I got this email from these people saying, oh, what do you think of this? We hope it's going to be very useful. I think if you just thought AI was going to be a new technology like a Google search or something, you could understand that. But it isn't. It's qualitatively different from everything else that's ever happened. I think and even the designers say that, and I really don't think it's an exaggeration. I don't think we even know what this thing is yet. So I think the idea that we should just plunge into it in an unquestioning way is very naive. I think generally people have naive attitudes to technology because we're not trained how to think about it. And there's a very common attitude that people tend to have that technology is a neutral thing and we can either do good or bad with it. And in some cases that might be true. If you have a knife, you could cut your bread with it or you could stab somebody with it. So in that sense, yes, that's the case. But also every technology, especially digital ones, have a teleology. They take you in a certain direction. So the smartphone's a good example of this. Yes, of course, you could use your smartphone to read a prayer, in the church or communicate with people as a priest. And people do that. But the actual thing that the smartphone does to your mind and does to your society is out of your control. So yes, you could use it for good or you could use it for evil. You can watch pornography on it or you can read the Gospels on it. But still, the smartphone has changed the way you think and it's changed your society and it's changed your relationship with other people. So that's what AI is going to do, but a millionfold, because AI is going to be in control of things. If AI is the thing they say it's going to be, it's not going to be a tool you can use. You're going to be a thing that it uses. And once you give it a certain amount of power, it's going to be able to do anything it wants with that power. And I think that we just need to be very, very clear about that. These things are designed to be intelligences which are moving towards being greater intelligences than us. This is what they're supposed to be. If you're looking at the kind of AI that they're talking about, these superhuman AIs, the question from a Christian perspective seems to me to be what actually is that thing and what relationship should you have with that thing, rather than just, can we get the gospel out there quick? Let's get more bums on seats. I don't believe that the job of the Christian church is just to run along behind the culture, 5 minutes behind it saying, quick, we must keep up with this latest thing. I actually think that young people especially don't respect that version of Christianity anyway. They don't want to see a Christianity that's trying to be like the rest of the culture. They want to see what Christianity was in the first place, which is a counterculture, which says that, actually the devil is the prince of this world, and you better remember that all the time. And we still have to live in it, but let's not be unwise. I mean, look, it could be that I'm being paranoid and this is all ridiculous, but I'm always conscious of the fact that the people issuing the greatest warnings are the people creating these things.
Yeah.
And I think people, it's I don't know, all I've tried to do in this book is say a bit about this, but I think people really need, and this is probably true of say priests and pastors and people who are really spreading the word out there more than anyone else, just try and educate themselves about what's going on, so they can work out what the relationship should be. But there's no easy answer to it, because we're all having to live in this age that we don't know how to negotiate, and we don't know what's, a year around the corner. So it's a very strange and disturbing situation, but I think we have to sort of wise up to the forces that are in play.
At the risk of kind of defeating the purpose of the entire conversation that we're having here, I feel almost like I did in Wendell Berry's kitchen when my smartphone started ringing, and I was kind of wanting to retreat back into the wall. But I was curious as I was reading your book, what would AI say about this? So I took this entire section we're talking about now, and I went to ChatGPT and said, read this and tell me, do you think that this is overly pessimistic or hysterical, or what would your evaluation be? And the response was, no, I think this is quite reasonable. And started furthering your argument.
Well, that's reassuring, or not.
Or not. And I thought I was really expecting some sort of a response that says, no, these are tools that can be used for good or bad. And I responded by saying, no, you realize he's suggesting that AI might be a portal into something very dark and pre-existing. And the response was, I know. And I think his arguments are reasonable and should be weighed.
And I've seen other people asking, I mean, I've never used an AI and I'm not going to, but I've seen other people asking AI this exact question and having it confirm what they say. Now, I think there is also there is a caution. As I say, I've never used an AI, but I have people I speak to who use ChatGPT all the time say it does have a tendency to confirm what you think, what it thinks you want to hear. Right?
And that's why I made the argument that it seems to me, I worded it this way, it seems to be that this is overly pessimistic and hysterical. How would I argue that? And that's what I was surprised, because I was expecting it to take the cues that I had given as they do and come back with a way to prop up the argument that it thought I was making, and it didn't.
Yeah. And as I say, I've seen other people having long conversations with ChatGPT in which the thing actually almost openly says, yes, there are demons behind this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, you never know what questions are leading it or whatever, but there's something very strange going on. And if even the AI is admitting it, then it might be worth paying attention.
I actually had a conversation not long ago with an atheist, not specifically about AI, but about some aspects of the machine, where I said, it seems to me that Ephesians 2, the prince of the power of the air, driving us along by the desires of the body and of the mind, in an algorithmic sort of world, the idea of invisible but personal forces working alongside us isn't that incredible anymore, is it? And
no,
he said,
no. What did he say?
He said, no, I would have said 20 years ago, that's an ancient superstition. We've moved beyond it. And now I would say, yeah, we're experiencing something like that.
Well, that's an interesting answer from an atheist. Was he kind of a scientific materialist type who didn't believe in that sort of thing?
I think he's a scientific materialist who, like a lot of them, are kind of at a point of a felt inconsistency that they don't know how to resolve.
It's difficult to be a scientific materialist at the
Yeah,
moment, isn't it?
it is. It
Well, I
is.
think there's something very strange happening. And again, as I say, if you are a Christian and you believe in the prince of this world and the prince of the powers of the air and the powers and principalities and the rest of it, these beings that are openly against God and are openly against us, are openly opposing our path back to God. I don't know. The question I like to ask myself, if I was the devil, would I invent the internet? Would it be a good tool to take humans away from God? Would it be a good tool to take us away from a prayerful mindset? Would it be a good tool to set us against each other? Would it be a good tool to introduce any number of horribly dark things, from snuff movies to internet porn for 10-year-olds to, mad ideologies that twist people's minds? I mean, people are going quite mad. Society is going quite mad. We would not have a culture war of the kind we've got if we didn't have social media, for example. Doesn't mean there
Yeah.
wouldn't be conflicts, but there wouldn't be anything like this. There's something it feels quite demonic. And like you say, I think even people who are not remotely Christian or religious can look at this and think there's something funny going on. So, yeah, I think it's just worth thinking about. If we believe that these powers and principalities exist, what would they be doing at the moment? What would they, what tools would they use to do those things? This would be the perfect one.
I often think, to return to Wendell Berry, I often think about something he said to a group of environmental activists when he said, we make the mistake of thinking that the scale of the solutions has to be at the same level as the scale of the problem. When in reality, a huge problem is often answered by many very small solutions. I think a lot of, particularly Christians, when they're looking at this machine sort of world around us right now, will say, "Well, I mean, what can you do?" This is just sort of inevitably where we're all moving. So what can you do? If you were to suggest to somebody, here are some things you actually can do to identify how you're being affected by the machine, and to try to steel yourself against it, or to create something different in your life, what sorts of things would you counsel?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I try to spend the last section of the book talking about that. I mean, broadly speaking, I would be on the same page as Wendell Berry. None of us has the power to change the big picture of things. We can't change the direction of technology. We're not going to stop the development of AI, unfortunately. What we can do is two things. We can make changes in our own lives if we want to do that, and we can get together with others and talk to others who feel the same about it. And that's actually how most change happens. There's a little section in the book in which I talk about technological asceticism, which I think is quite a useful way of looking at it from a Christian perspective. If we look at the Christian ascetic tradition, we have a tradition which literally comes from the word askesis in Greek, which means exercise, spiritual exercise, which often involves, say, fasting, prayer, vigils, quite a disciplined, rigorous life, most obviously in the monastic tradition, but all Christians are doing it to some degree. If we were to apply that ascetic understanding of the world to technologies, we would ask ourselves, well, what relationship should I be having with technology? What technology should I cut out of my life? What technologies should I be limiting? How much time should I be spending on a screen? Do I want my children to have a smartphone? Do I want to have a smartphone? Should I be using an AI system? If I understand what these things might be doing to me spiritually and physically and mentally, should I engage with them? And if so, to what degree? As much as anything, it's about asking questions and then drawing lines and staying behind the lines. So one of my lines is I've decided not to use AI and I don't use it. It may be that when I'm online, I'm unconsciously using it every time I do a Google search or something, but I'm never going to deliberately use it because I'm not going to go there. People will have their own lines. Some people don't have computers at all. Some people don't have smartphones. Some people don't use apps, whatever. That's one thing you can do. You have to generally have an intelligent relationship with technology. You have to understand the way that this system is operating and decide how you and your family can actually live within it. I mean, someone like Wendell Berry is a good example of one line that's drawn. He's never had a computer and he's never going to, but he does have a telephone, presumably, and he does have electricity in his house. So, you choose what relationship you want to have with this thing, because if you don't do that, it's going to choose the relationship for you. And you're just going to be dragged full pelt into a world in which you can't exist without a smartphone, you can't exist without using an AI system, and you just become harvest, as I put it in the book. You become something that is harvested by the machine. You become not just a consumer, but someone whose data and identity and image is constantly being harvested and fed into the AIs that you're endlessly reacting to. So you have to choose your relationship with technology and with society in general. You have to get together with other people who are doing the same thing, because that's one way of making you feel less alone. Educate yourself about what's going on. I always find the Amish a very good example of this. People, I'm no expert on them, but if we look at the way Amish communities relate to technology, they have a question that they ask, which is, if we adopt this new thing, what will it do to our community and what will it do to our spiritual life? And they may then adopt a technology, test it out for a year, and then have a community vote on whether they want to continue it after they've monitored what it's going to do to them. And, whether or not you want to be Amish, and you probably don't unless you are already, it's an intelligent way to relate to technology. It asks the right questions. It asks, what are these things going to do to me? What will they do to my community? What will they do to my family? Can I reject them if they have a negative impact? And we don't do that in our society. We just have a blanket acceptance of all new things, and then we deal with the consequences afterwards. And I think if we can have a more intelligent relationship in our own lives, it will benefit us.
When you talk about building God, I can't help but think of Genesis 10-11, Tower of Babel. If they achieve this, nothing will be impossible to them, is the line from God. And of course, there's a disruption of all of that. The unity is torn apart. The project is torn apart, and then immediately after, we have the call of Abram out of Ur. Do you? I mean, obviously, none of us can know, but do you think that we're in one of those moments where there will be a collapse and a rebuilding towards something more human, or do you suspect we're kind of at the end point?
Well, who knows the answer to that? But
Yeah.
The Tower of Babel story is a very good analogy for where we are. It's very much what we're doing. We're just, we have a digital Tower of Babel that we're constructing for the same kind of aim. And the tower is that, the people are scattered when that happens, and I suspect they may be scattered again. Who knows what? Nobody knows. Nobody knows the future. Nobody knows when the end is coming. Nobody knows any of that, of course.
Right.
But the optimistic view that I have, even after talking about all this doom for an hour, is that actually, at some level, I don't think it's possible to achieve what these people want to achieve. They're not going to build God, because you can't do that. Yeah. They're not actually going to build a genuine conscious being, because you can't do that either. Only God can do that. I don't think we can create life. We can create a good simulacrum of one, but we can't create the real thing. And I don't think that, I suspect they wouldn't even be able to generate the level of electricity they'd need to use to create the superhuman AI. They don't even have that at the moment. And I also think society is becoming so fragile and so fractured, and people are already kind of rebelling against it, because it's not actually fundamentally possible to live in a way that's that inhuman for very long. So in that sense, I have a faith in the human spirit. I don't think people actually want to live in the machine, and in the way that that we're being taken into it. I'm very struck by the fact that all the guys in Silicon Valley send their children to Steiner schools and don't let them have any technology, because they know what it does, and even they don't want it. They don't want it either. So I actually feel that even amongst young people, some of whom are, say, going back to dumb phones or refusing to engage in pornography, or indeed going back to church, which is becoming quite a significant trend now, something's brewing. That there's a kind of rebellion against it. So the optimistic possibility is that it will actually come down, because it's hubristic madness, and I certainly hope that's the case, and then we don't end up in a kind of Wendell Berry style defeat. But who knows? We don't know what the future is going to bring, do we? We have to just try and attempt to be human in this age.
Yes. Yeah, the book is called Against the Machine: On the Unmaking of Humanity. It is, I will tell you, it is unsettling, haunting, but riveting, and ultimately, I think, as you've just heard, gives a vision of hope. Paul Kingsnorth, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.